Recently, the Gateway Arch grounds have received considerable attention, and one reason is the 2010 design competition that the MVVA team won. But another, perhaps less known, are the cultural landscape reports for the grounds that document its landscape design history. Mary Hughes, then with the National Park Service, led this initiative some 15 years ago after realizing that the staff maintaining the grounds was not aware of Saarinen's and Kiley's design intentions for the landscape. For all the acclaim bestowed on Saarinen for his creation of the arch, there was little acknowledgement of the collaborative team that designed the grounds or that the landscape was key to the memorial experience. In the early 90s, few people on site realized that Kiley designed the landscape at all. It's not surprising. He completed his work in '65, and the landscape wasn't completed until 1981. So as you can imagine, one aspect of the ground's complexity and transformation is the issue of authorship. What sort of changes were made between '65 and '81? These issues have been addressed by an article that Mary Hughes wrote and also by the revised Cultural Landscape Report, first written by Gina Bellavia and Greg Bleem and later edited by Rob McGinnis and his associates at AECOM EDAW. So as one of a large team of consultants working with MVVA on the competition, I focused on a second aspect of the ground's complexity, not the issue of authorship, but the difficulty of reconciling mainstream values for historic preservation with those values related to biophysical health or environmental sustainability. The former sees stunning allées and pastoral lawns draping over undulating sculptural landforms, and the latter sees a monoculture allée, underperforming plants, eroding slopes, and mucky ponds. Renovation of the allées, the lawns, and the ponds make no sense from a sustainable design perspective, yet substantial reworking of the subsurface soil and water infrastructure is necessary for any landscape on the surface to be healthy. This conundrum is a fundamental challenge to some historic preservationists who approach the issue of significance and integrity through a material culture lens. For them, integrity resides in the physical stuff of the place, the amount and the exact arrangement of surface materials and elements. So a sustainable design retrofit that replaced a monoculture allée with a mix of species or that reshaped the pond edge to reduce fertilizer nutrients and eliminating the lawn might be criticized for removing what the Park Service would call the character-defining features of this modernist landscape. Now, this conflict is not specific to the Gateway Arch grounds. It is common to many mid-20th century designed landscapes that are built on sites of modernization, former industrial precincts that were cleared during urban renewal. The mechanical processes of demolition and clearing resulted in considerable damage to the biotic health of the soil. Landscape architects of the period were not very sophisticated about remediating those issues. So in modernist spaces like the Arch grounds, and you can see it prior to construction here, or another project by Kiley, Independence Mall, or a project of a similar period by the Park Service, Constitution Gardens off the DC Mall, were grafted onto the very real and gritty subsurfaces of urban renewal sites. They had a little chance of reaching maturity and creating the effects that were intended by the designers. In other words, these conceptual sites of high modernism were not a tabula rasa, a blank slate. They were biophysical wastelands of compacted construction rubble with poor soil structure, low oxygen levels, restricted root growth, and pathogenic fungus organisms. And a big thank you to Melissa Elliott for helping me with all these historic images. As we've been pondering this conundrum during the design competition phase, several of us found ourselves at odds with the position that contemporary sustainability performance criteria should trump the historic landscape. How could we develop an approach that opened up a space for action in between those conventional positions and practices? And here I drew on my own research and teaching about Dan Kiley. Many of you know that he wrote repeatedly and spoke repeatedly about his medium, the spatiality of landscape. And moreover, he meant more than volumetric space. He talked about the spatial experience of walking through and around alleys, bosques, and groves. Could an emphasis on landscape space that affected the memorial experience, instead of on landscape elements and features, provide a way around the seeming conflicts between historic preservation guidelines and a sustainability ethic? Key to this thesis were Saarinen and Kiley's own words. Saarinen wrote of his pleasure in finding a shared form world, the catenary arches found in the arch itself and the site plan, as well as in the lines and planes of the alleys and the spatial vocabulary that both the designers deployed. They wrote of the arch grounds as more than a setting. They described it as a mooring to both the city and the vast continent of Western expansion to which the memorial was dedicated. So the grounds were to be arranged as a matrix of abstracted woods, meadows, and prairie lagoons. Their references were regional and continental, not suburban in association, woods and prairies, not grass and trees. Excited, in fact, inspired by this realization that the shared form world relied as much on planted form types as on the site plan, as much on the emotive effects of the planting design as specific plant locations, a group of MVVA landscape architects, including Andrew Gutterman and Neil Budzinski, and my small cohort in Charlottesville, Katie Towson and Addie Pierce McManaman, began to mine the cultural landscape reports for project drawings and plant lists. So first we compared the actual planting plans completed by Kiley with what was planted and what exists today. The simple spatial diagram of the 3 planting plans, Kiley's on the top, reveals that the Kiley plantings had more spatial heterogeneity than what was actually installed, and that observation directed our reading towards comments Kiley made about the planting's relationship to the memorial experience. The following diagrams share a genealogy with the consulting work I did with Michael on the Wellesley College campus about 10 years ago. In both cases, I was experimenting with graphic techniques for revealing the form and the experience of the landscape medium. At Wellesley, the geological landforms, and here at Gateway Arch, the role of plants and their arrangement, planted form, within the memorial experience. A simple way of explaining our findings is this: the site plan does not contain all aspects of the spatial organization. The species of plants matter, their size, form, and character. The difference between the ash that were planted and the tulip poplar that were specified is not just horticultural or botanical, it is also scalar and experiential. As one can see here from the comparative scale drawings, there were issues not only of dimension, but also of character. And as one of the Van Valkenburgh renderings demonstrate, texture, color, and atmosphere, as well as the associations that a tulip poplar has with pioneer successional species, were all germane and different. When that section was experienced sequentially along the extended memorial approach, we began to realize the modulation of the alley's spacing in relationship to other adjacencies, and I'll talk about the ponds and the valleys. We began to understand that the groves in the valley reinforced the memorial procession between the city and the arch. So these pond and valley plantings were not merely the setting, they were key to the processional rhythmic spatial experience of the grounds. The next set of drawings refined this observation. Guided by Kiley's accounts, we identified 5 planted form types that were present on the grounds in the original scheme and not all present today. Forest alley, cypress glade, forest edge, screen, and meadow, each with their own distinct characteristics and densities. We also looked to the understory trees, their blooming characteristics, and realized another way that Kiley's medium created difference across the site. And finally, there were spatial differences that could be understood in terms of planted form zones. So our technique recognized the differences between what was conceived and what was installed. And these were useful for many reasons, including issues of authorship and changes during the design process. But importantly for us, they were tools for conceiving of a way to work out of the preservation and sustainability divide. So instead of thinking about one-to-one replacements of individual trees within the pond and valley areas, a landscape zone maintenance plan could simultaneously reinforce the intended memorial character of the grounds and perhaps incrementally over time also reinvigorate the degraded environmental infrastructure, its ecosystems. This way of decoding Saarinen and Kiley's design intentions and spatial practices affords MVVA and their environmental consultants new tactics for working on the site and for reinvigorating the core historically, biophysically, and socially. I was particularly heartened by the response to this analysis of the many environmental consultants, as they could imagine how to work within a historic landscape framework of zones and spatial effects, much better than one totally reliant on a material culture methodology with a one-to-one element replacement. And similarly, requests from the St. Louis citizens for universal access throughout the grounds could be explored in relationship to these planted form zones. The projects could be considered as part of a long-term strategy of reinvigorating the soil within the planted form zones and reinforcing the memorial spatial experience, instead of thinking of these changes as a series of compromising interventions in a significant design landscape. Well, what are the lessons to be gleaned from the Arch Grounds competition experience? I think first and foremost, the grounds have begun to be understood as a complex landscape matrix that's social, a product of modernization, biophysical, an ailing urban ecosystem, and historical, the product of a collaboration between two highly regarded designers. Second, complex projects require complex thinking and approaches that are attuned to specific design histories. NVVA has assembled a team and choreographed a design process that includes research and theoretical speculation, as well as strategy and creativity. And in doing so, they're addressing specific client needs, but they're also establishing conditions for challenging simple boundaries between complex issues like design history and an urban environmental history, sustainability and preservation, innovative design and heritage conservation, between landscape modernism as a style and modernization as a process of site transformation. This perspective has broad implications for a lot of other modernist projects on urban renewal sites, and they're varied and widespread, as we've heard before. Modernist landscapes built on sites of modernization are complex and, yes, even complicated. They warrant complex thinking that spans disciplines and doesn't simply adhere to guidelines or best management practices. Our focus on the intended spatial and emotive effect of the landscape medium versus the extent, historical, and unsustainable material culture provided one way to navigate through the convoluted issues of authorship, significance, and the appropriate degree of change that hovers around all discussions of the future of the Arch Grounds. In the next talk, you'll hear some of the other avenues for dealing through this complexity from one of my favorite collaborators, Michael Van Valkenburgh.